Welcome to Semantic Web Technologies. Lecture number 6, Applications in the Web of Data. Today, we want to talk about ontology design. As you remember, up to now, what we did was only ontology hacking, so we had no methodology that tells us how to develop big, huge, large ontologies and how to do this in a team, in a distributed way, in a distributed fashion. So the problem is, how do we design an efficient and well-suited ontology? So as for example, here in adapted version of Geek and Poke, we start with something, we have a rather difficult, confusing process, and in the end, we end up with a great ontology. So this is, in general, the so-called ontology development process. Okay, we need methodologies for ontology design. What is it? A methodology of ontology design describes all activities that are necessary for the construction of an ontology. And we need a formal methodology to develop so-called consistent ontologies, because we do not want to have inconsistencies in our ontologies, because this requires time and effort to remove this. Then, of course, we need efficient methods for the efficient development of complex ontologies. So we want to avoid redundancies. And especially when we are developing ontologies in teams, so if we are distributed in some fashion and want to develop ontologies, then of course everybody in that team has to follow a given formal methodology. So these methodologies, there exist several ones, they have something in common. And here in 1997, Fernandez-Lopez et al., they distinguished the following activities in ontology design methodologies. So they have first the so-called ontology management activities, then all activities that are concerned about the development of ontologies, and then they define so-called support activities. And today we want to have a deeper look into these three different kinds of activities. Okay, let's start with the ontology management activities. Scheduling is the first important thing. Of course, we have to identify all tasks, all problems that have to be solved when we want to develop a new ontology. And therefore, of course, we have to arrange and to plan all these tasks and problems that have to be solved. And to do this, we have to identify all required resources in terms of time, of money, of memory, of infrastructure, and so on. So scheduling is a very important management activity. So every step in the ontology development process has to be controlled, because we want to guarantee the correct execution of all the tasks and problems we have identified and that have to be solved. And moreover, we do not only have to control this and to guarantee the correct execution, we always have to make sure that the quality is sufficient. So it means quality assurance at the third part of ontology management activities is really important. So we have to assure that all produced resources during the development process, they come up to a given level of quality. So this concerns, of course, ontologies, it concerns software, as well as the documentation for all of that that we develop. So these are the ontology management activities. So next step would be the ontology development. And there, they define three different steps: the pre-development activities, everything what is done before the ontology itself, it's developed, then the development activities, and then what is done after the development, the post-development activities. Let's start with the pre-development activities. What you have to do first is a so-called environment study. So you have to take a look, so for what software platform is the ontology designated for? So which applications should apply this ontology that we develop? So this is the so-called environment study, because the effort that you invest into the development of the ontology, of course, depends upon the environment, the given environment. Then, of course, you have to ask if everything, or you have to make sure that everything is feasible. So you have to do a feasibility study. Can the ontology really be developed with the means that are really available? Does it make sense to develop the ontology? Does it make sense in terms of, is it cost efficient? Can we really afford to make this ontology? Or is there some other solution that we can avoid developing this ontology? So this must be clear before the development starts. So you have here the environment study first and the feasibility study. Then comes the development stage. And here in the development stage, you start with the so-called specification. And there you ask, for example, why is the ontology developed? What is the benefit and who are the end users for whom this ontology and the application around the ontology is intended for? And when you have asked these questions, you start with the so-called conceptualization. So you try and start to build up a model. It means you structure the domain knowledge into a conceptual model. And for this, you need the help, of course, of domain experts, because you, as a knowledge engineer, might not have the knowledge of the domain that you want to represent with the ontology. When you have the conceptualization, you try to formalize this conceptualization. So first, you do this, for example, with a semi-computable model, for example, in first-order logic. But for the implementation, then, you need, in the end, a computable model in some ontology representation language. But then the process doesn't stop. We have the post-development phase. And in the post-development phase, you have to think about things like maintenance, for example. Of course, you need maintenance because the world that you have modeled with the ontology does not stop, and it changes. It changes continuously, and therefore maybe your ontology has to be adapted, and therefore you have to consider maintenance routines. So when, for example, are updates and adjustments of the ontology necessary? And also you must consider use and reuse. So which are the designated applications that use the ontology? And are there maybe also unplanned applications that can also make use of the ontology? During the life cycle, when the ontology is already developed, then in the end there might turn up new applications that say, hey, this is a great ontology, why don't we use it? So reuse belongs to the post-development process. And around the development process, there are a bunch of support activities. So one of them is the knowledge acquisition. Knowledge acquisition is important because you want to represent the knowledge within a domain or an application inside your ontology. Therefore, you have to interview all these domain experts that are specialists and experts in their domain, and to get the knowledge from them that you later on put into the conceptualization, into the knowledge representation. So knowledge acquisition is one of the most important activities. And of course, when you gather the knowledge, when you build up the model, you have to define steps of evaluation. It means in each step of the development process, you have to define how to evaluate the ontology that you have already developed and how to make sure that this ontology that you have developed really fulfills all prerequisites. So you also must somehow consider the quality, and you do this by developing evaluation methods. Okay, and then there is the point, for example, you might reuse already existing ontologies, ontology reuse. So this is the activity of so-called integration. And there you consider, okay, we could use this or the other ontology for our problem. And in the end, it can also be mandatory to combine several either newly developed or already existing ontologies, to merge them. So merging is also a rather important activity where you construct a new ontology from already existing ontologies within a specific domain where the ontology should be developed for. Even more, there is so-called alignment. So if you are using several ontologies, you have to map the knowledge between them, and therefore you need mapping rules. You have to design and to apply mapping rules for the involved ontologies that you designate. In ontology A, some class denotes the same as class B in another ontology. So to enable this kind of communication and knowledge transfer, you have to also consider these alignment activities. And of course, you have to think about documentation. This is really necessary whenever you develop a huge ontology that covers a large and complex domain. So each step in the ontology development must be accurately documented. And of course, during the development cycle, which is an iterative process, you have to consider configuration management to manage all versions of documentation and also of developed ontologies of your, and to consider all these different versions, and if possible, when you have made a mistake, to switch back to an older version and then to somehow remove the mistake and stuff like that. So configuration management also is an important task. Overall, you can take a look at all these activities in one big schema. As you remember, we have these management activities. They contain scheduling, control, and quality assurance. We have the support activities on the other side, which have the knowledge acquisition, most important thing, evaluation, also very important, documentation, integration, merging, alignment, and configuration management. And then we have all these development-oriented activities. Pre-development, we had the environment study and feasibility study. Development, we had specification, conceptualization, formalization, and implementation. And then post-development, we had maintenance, use, and reuse. Okay. So this is what most or mostly all of these methodologies for ontology design have in common. Of course, in this course, there is not the time to cover all possible methodologies, and there is even also not the time to cover one of the really professional methodologies because they are really sophisticated. But what we can do is we can have a look at the so-called ontology design one-on-one, which is a rather simple methodology which includes several of the points you have already seen here in the general ontology development cycle, and which is intended for scholarly use. It means it's for educational purposes. And you can learn ontology design with this simple ontology design one-on-one that we will talk about in the next part of the lecture.